Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to go over what I think the top 5 most underrated mid laners are in solo queue at the moment in Season 12. Like usual, everything is time-stamped at the bottom, so if you want to skip ahead you can do that. But first, I want to kind of give you guys a 1-minute explanation about like kind of why these champs have become stronger recently. So going into Season 12, there have been like 3 like really big changes. So those were the Scuttle Crab change, like not being worth as much, particularly that no longer is the game won or lost at the first Scuttle Crab. The second thing was TP not being able to be used to anything except a tower until 14 minutes. And finally was the objective bounties. So these 3 changes in combination, I guess, first off, the Scuttle Crab change and the TP change have made it so the early game as a whole is a lot slower, and particularly champions that struggle in the like very early levels where they couldn't really contest crabs like as well as some other champs have like those champions that couldn't do that have really like benefited as a result of this kind of meta change. And yeah, the early game in general has been slowed down by the TP change. There's less dives and stuff like that, and there's the game just like gets broken open a lot less. And then the final thing is that with the objective bounties being put in, there are lots of opportunities to come back into the game, and games I think go longer in general, or at least are decided later in the game. I felt like before, like a lot of the times, even if the game would drag on for a while, it was decided quite early on. So the kind of TLDR of these changes is it has made scaling champions and champions that are weak early much better compared to before. And you're definitely going to see that as a theme in these champions. But that's enough explaining. Let's get straight into it. So starting things off, we have Lux. So I think Lux is a champion that has actually always been like reasonably good in solo queue, but she's kind of suffered against other early game champions by not really being able to contest the first Scuttle Crab very easily. But now that this isn't a problem, like she's actually pretty strong. Lux has a pretty strong lane phase actually. She's kind of like Victor, where if the lane is kind of like isolated in 1v1, she can poke a lot of the other champions down, particularly like mage or mobile champions. She's a bit harder to play against like some of the assassin champions, but overall her lane phase is quite strong. She's also got like really good scaling, like you guys have probably seen, like Lux in team fights late game and mid game, absolutely ridiculous. And there's a lot of other things that Lux kind of has going for her in the current meta. She's got really strong wave clear, which means she can help stall out these games for either her or her teammates to reach their power spikes. And also I think one thing that's sort of underrated is that a lot of these champions that have global ultimates now are actually stronger than before, because it's not like you'd ever see Lux really like TP into bot lane before, but you'd see like plenty of other champs do that, right? On the other hand, Lux's ult is like quite commonly used to like just like go halfway down the river and like snipe someone from bot lane or top lane. In essence, like while these other champs got nerfed in the kind of impact they can have on the map, Lux's hasn't changed essentially, but you know, she's one of the few champs that can still impact other lanes without really having to sacrifice her own lane for it, and obviously doesn't need the TP. I think the reason Lux might not be higher on the list, at least for me, is I think she does have like some difficult assassin matchups. That being said, she is one of the few champs that like makes really good use of spells like barrier and heal. And I also think that she has like, especially in the, well, she has enough wave clear in the early game that a lot of the time after 6 especially, she can kind of just like ignore the opponent and doesn't really have to lane anymore. And also that her extreme range in team fights means you can build like these really greedy, just like full damage builds and not really get punished for it. But particularly against some assassins in that like first 6 levels or before you get your ult rather, can be quite difficult. That's why I don't have her higher on the list, but I think she is very good, and she's also like reasonably easy to play, so I recommend trying her out. So next up, number 4 on the list, we have Lucian. And now you guys are probably going to be quite confused by this, given what I just said before, but Lucian actually kind of thrives in this meta, and I'll explain why. So champions that accelerate themselves very fast, like Lucian or Rise or Kale, champions that can farm, can accelerate themselves very fast by like farming above the curve, actually want a slower game, because they want everyone else to be gathering resources at a slower rate while they accelerate themselves like beyond what is normal, basically, right? They're champions that can get like kind of that 12 CSPM, whereas some of the other champs can't, and are more reliant on like kills and skirmishes to get their goal. But Lucian I think while does sort of drop off in the mid game, does actually scale quite well into the late game. And I think while the games are a lot slower at the moment, it's like pretty nice to play Lucian. You have like really good control over the early game, and you can get like a massive, just like isolated 1v1 because there's much less like stuff going on around the map. And with stuff like the Scuttle Crab being less important, some champions that could kind of, I don't want to say cheese, but like there were some champions in solo queue that Lucian like would beat if it were a 1v1, but the problem is the game would too quickly become essentially not a 1v1. It would become like 2v2s and 3v3s. And Lucian really thrives when he can just use his mid prio to just kind of like either keep the enemy mid like pinned under tower and just like out CS them, outpace them on the map, or when he would just be like dominating the mid 1v1 like that, or again like you could use your prio to invade the enemy jungle, which is still possible obviously. But yeah, overall, I really like Lucian. I think he is like more difficult to play, which is again kind of why I have him a bit lower. But I think he is quite good. He does scale really well. You know, there is like this kind of like mid-game fall off where you don't really have the items to deal with like heavy tanks, although there aren't that many tanks in the game at the moment. I guess another thing to kind of be careful about is like while Lucian can accelerate himself really hard, if you do fall behind, you will have a pretty hard time catching up. And that's another reason why he might be a bit lower on this list for me. But yeah, overall, I think he is quite strong and he benefits a lot more than other early game champions from the meta changes. So yeah, if you like playing AD carries mid, I think you could certainly give him a go. I think I will also be doing a Lucian guide in the future, so hopefully that will be helpful as well. At number 3, we have Sion mid. So this is one that, like, if you guys watch the buffs, you probably agree with. But something he always says, and something I definitely agree with, is that Sion actually has much better matchups in mid lane than he does top. And that's because a lot of the mid lane champions, you've got like the assassins and stuff, that can never really kill a Sion. And then on the other hand, we have a lot of the mages that don't have the mana to kind of deal with Sion in the early game. And similar to Lucian, Sion is a champion that can really accelerate himself. So really like does well in those slow games. Like Sion can farm above the clock like very well. He also just like in general accelerates quite well with like his W passive where he's gaining all this extra HP. So I think while Sion doesn't scale super well into like the ultra late game, I guess maybe if you're playing AD Sion, it's pretty different, right? But I think if you're playing regardless of whether you're playing like tank Sion or AD Sion, you're going to be very impactful in like this mid game period. And I think that's the point of the game where you can have already accelerated yourself. Like I think the early game, you can, you know, while you're in mid, you can easily farm the wave. You can try farm the enemy raptors. A lot of the time you'll just be able to demolish the tower because they won't be able to deal with you, particularly if they roam. Like you can punish them a lot for it. So I think for similar reasons as Lucian, like Sion is a champion that scales reasonably well, and wants a game where it's like reasonably slower. It's not to say that he doesn't benefit from kills and stuff, because you know absolutely Sion does. But it's more like if the game is slower and other people aren't getting those kills, Sion can still get a huge chunk of his gold from farm. That being said, you do have to actually be farming, right? Like I think if you're just like running around the map, you're not really going to scale very well. But if you're like consistently clearing the waves and then like using your mid prio to either demolish the enemy tower or to take enemy camps away in the mid game, like keeping your CS above the clock with farming a lot of camps, I think Sion can be very powerful. Another thing that's like very nice about picking Sion mid is that most people will assume it's top. So more often than not, you'll be able to get like a favorable matchup, or your opponent will just be picking a blind pick champion. And I think another kind of nice thing is that a lot of the safe blind picks right now, for example, Ahri, they don't deal well with tankier champs, so Sion can be very good against stuff like this. But yeah, so overall, I think it's just like a solid option. It's a flexible pick. I think it does like pretty well in the meta. So it could be another champ that you guys want to try out if you need either an AD champ or a tanky champ in your champion pool. Now, number 2 on this list, we have Anivia. So Anivia's been strong in solo queue for a pretty long time now, but I think she's always kind of been underrated by the general player base, probably because like not many streamers and not many pro players play her, so she just kind of doesn't get seen as much, but I think she is quite good. So Anivia is a champ that historically has kind of struggled in that, like, particularly in the first few levels, there are some champions that Anivia can like cheese in the level like 2 or level 1 and do like a significant amount of damage. Sometimes getting all in with electrocute or ignite, but particularly if you're against like a mage champion or something, you would lose prior, and then it would be quite hard to contest for the Scuttle Crab. But now that this isn't as much of an issue, if you're against one of those champions, you can just kind of play safe in that early game. And then after you know that level 3 mark, you start kind of being able to play the game a bit more, but particularly after level 6, you've got a very strong lane, you've got like very strong scaling, you also have some very strong stalling ability. You can you can, if your team falls behind, you can keep the game going for a really long time with your wave clear. She also does very, very well into like short range compositions. Teams with a lot of melee champs get punished quite hard by Anivia. So yeah, overall, I think there are a lot of good things about Anivia, and I'd say she is, for the most part, blindable. There are some mages that kind of, some really long-range mages, say like Xerath and stuff, that can be quite troublesome, but I think a lot of these champs are immobile, and you might be able to punish them in lane, either with your jungler or just by yourself. Yeah, so I would say Anivia is like a really strong pick overall. Just has a lot of stuff going for her. Uses the items at the moment reasonably well. So yeah, basically not many bad things to say about Anivia. I'd say her biggest weakness is probably immobility, and there are some comps with either lots of hard engage, or I guess, yeah, comps with lots of range, like we were saying before, that can kind of punish this. But I think in solo queue against like most champs, Anivia does do quite well. So I'd highly recommend trying her out if you enjoy her. Now, number 1 on the list, we have Vladimir. So I think Vlad is super, super strong in solo queue. Again, another champ that really suffered in those early levels and like would lose a lot of games because of like some stupid Scuttle Crab shenanigans in solo queue. But Vlad has really strong scaling. He's very strong in the side lane. He has a lot of tools for like dodging ganks and just dealing with other champions that a lot of mid lane champs just kind of struggle with in general. I think one thing that's quite underrated about Vladimir as well is, despite being like a really strong like mid-late game champ, as well as having like a really good side lane, is that he actually has really high kill pressure in lane, particularly with Electrocute Ignite. You can often get like 100-0 kill at level 6 or after picking up a little bit of AP. And also Vlad is one of those champs where like if you fall behind in lane to a Vlad, it's like super, super hard to ever come back. And then if you're on the flip side, if the Vlad is the one that falls behind, oftentimes they can actually kind of like mitigate what you're doing quite a lot, because he has sustain and he has his pool, which can make it, depending on the champ, can make it quite difficult to punish him. Vlad in general is a champion that's like very, very rewarding to learn. Having the ability to have not only super strong scaling, but also like really high kill pressure in lane, as well as a strong side lane, is just, it feels like too much for me. I think he's really strong, at least. I do think there could be some growing pains with learning Vlad. Like, he does kind of test your team fighting quite a bit. You do need to find like flanks and like be kind of good about your timing and stuff like that. But he's not the most difficult champ mechanically, so you can kind of put all your brain sauce into learning and focusing on these like team fighting fundamentals. I think lastly, it is really underrated and not often like thought about just how unforgiving it is to fall behind to Vladimir. I think like oftentimes you could argue something like, oh, well, if you're falling behind to Vladimir as like the squishy champ, you should die. And I mean, that's true somewhat, but like a lot of the time, if say you're laning evenly against a Vladimir and he gets a kill in a skirmish, you can just be like completely boned after that. And that's not the case for many other champions. A lot of the other ones, they still have like they still have a fair amount of counterplay, but once Vlad gets ahead and he gets the ability to just kill you with Electrocute Ignite from full HP, it becomes much, much more difficult to deal with. So yeah, that's why I think Vlad is probably the most underrated mid laner in solo queue at the moment. So that's it for this video, guys. I have been thinking about creating like a full mid lane tier list, but I think I've shown you now some of the champions that I think are like sort of underrated. And I've also tried to give reasoning so that you guys can kind of like think to yourselves what other champs might be good as well. If you guys are really interested in a full mid lane tier list, like let me know. Also, if there are any other champions that you think I've missed or that you think are really underrated, do let me know in the comments. I'd actually be pretty interested to kind of see like what the general player base as a whole thinks is underrated. But yeah, anyway, bit of a quicker video today, guys. Let me know if you like it. Go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.